This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. About halfway between Buffalo, New York, and Erie, Pennsylvania, is the small, gated community of Lilydale, a hamlet of Pomfret, New York. Lilydale's year-round population is estimated to be around 275 people. Lilydale was founded as the Cassadaga Lake Free Association in 1879 as a spiritualist community. Before that, spiritualists had already been holding summer camp meetings in the area for several years on a farm belonging to fervent spiritualist William Alden. And the 20 acres they purchased after his death were near his farm. In spiritualism, one of the many religious traditions born of 19th century New York State, practitioners believe they can communicate with the spirits of people who have died, often through a medium. At the Cassadaga Lake Free Association summer camps, believers and mediums gathered together for readings and for talks. Within a decade after the founding, they had also built permanent structures, such as a large lecture hall, a grand hotel, a post office, and 100 cottages. Lilydale still has a public summer camp season. In 2025, that season will be held June 20th to August 31st. But there are also people who are permanent residents at Lilydale. According to the Lilydale website, quote, Lilydale is a quiet, close-knit community with approximately 169 leaseholds located in a 3-mile walking radius, unquote. You may have noted the word leasehold in the passage above. Further down, the same website notes, quote, purchasing a home in Lilydale is not a typical real estate transaction, unquote. In fact, in Lilydale, individuals can purchase homes, but not the land on which the homes stand. The Lilydale Association owns all of the land and leases it out to the homeowners. The homeowners themselves must be members in good standing of the Lilydale Assembly, and they have to apply to the Lilydale Board of Directors for approval to purchase. The Lilydale Association is a corporation, which, in their 1879 charter, said they were, quote, devoted to benevolent, charitable, literary, and scientific purposes and mutual improvement in religious knowledge, unquote. That broad membership corporation was more narrowly defined in 1957, when the board added language to the charter regarding the, quote, mutual improvement in the religious knowledge of spiritualism, unquote. In 1933, Lilydale had formally affiliated with the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, NSAC, meaning that applicants who are not members of the NSAC can be formally prohibited from purchasing homes in Lilydale. Among the people who live in Lilydale full-time are licensed mediums who operate out of their homes. At Lilydale, mediums must be vetted and tested before being registered with the Assembly, as well as with the Mediums League. By 1949, physical mediumship, exemplified by things like loud noises or raps or materialized objects or bodies, was outlawed in Lilydale. Prior to that, physical mediumship had been quite popular, and one of the reasons visitors came to Lilydale. And, in fact, tourism did drop off when physical mediumship was banned. However, as early as 1903, the Lilydale Board had recognized the danger posed to the whole community by fraudulent mediums, writing, quote, "We believe that through the different phenomenon of spiritualism, a large number of seekers receive ocular proofs of the truth of spiritualism, and we, therefore, desire to encourage and endorse honest mediumship. But, as we have found by repeated experiences, that a large number attending seances and having private sittings have received fraudulent manifestations, we would recommend that all physical and other manifestations of mediumships shall be given under the auspices of the trustees and in buildings as may be designated by them, that all manifestations be held under such conditions as may be agreed upon by the mediums and the trustees, with a special view to guard against fraud." Unquote. Spiritualism did not, of course, begin in Lilydale. But Lilydale was, for a while, the physical home of the birthplace of spiritualism. Modern spiritualism traces its roots to Hydesville, New York, where in 1848, 14-year-old Maggie Fox and her 11-year-old sister Kate began to hear raps on walls and furniture that they believed was communication from the spirit of a peddler named Charles B. Rosna, who had been murdered and was buried in their cellar. 68 years later, in 1916, long after the Fox sisters had risen to fame and spiritualism was an established religion, Benjamin F. Bartlett purchased the Fox family's Hydesville home and moved it 150 miles to Lilydale, donating it to the Lilydale Assembly. Although only one of the Fox sisters, Maggie, had ever even visited Lilydale, and then only for one summer, the Fox cottage became a key attraction of Lilydale, which advertised it as the birthplace of modern spiritualism. In the 1930s, Lilydale started charging 25 cents admission to visit the cottage. And in 1939, the Lilydale program described the Fox house as, quote, "one of Lilydale's outstanding Diamond Jubilee attractions, the most noted memorial of spiritualism," unquote. Unfortunately, in 1955, the Fox house burned down, with no reason ever determined. All that remains in Lilydale now is a clearing with a plaque memorializing the Fox sisters and their home. Today, the National Spiritualist Association of Churches is headquartered in Lilydale. They define spiritualism as, quote, "the science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life, based upon the demonstrated fact of communication by means of mediumship with those who live in the spirit world, unquote. And they list associated spiritualist churches in 19 states and DC. Joining me now to help us learn more about Lilydale and about spiritualism more generally is Dr. Averill Earls, assistant professor of history at St. Olaf College, executive producer of Dig, a history podcast, and one of the authors of Spiritualism's Place: Reformers, Seekers, and Seances in Lilydale. Hi, Averill. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.
Yes, always a pleasure to speak with another podcaster. So I would like to start by asking actually just a little bit about the Dig History podcast, how that got started, what you do with that. And that one, of course, is a very academic podcast. So I'd just like to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, great. So Dig History podcast started because my co-producers and I, co-founders and I, Sarah Hanley Cousins, Elizabeth Garner Mazurek, and Marissa Rhodes were grad students at University at Buffalo in 2015, and we founded a different podcast, in part because we just sort of wanted to feel out the medium. And then as we got our sort of sea legs under us, we realized that there was this sort of disconnect in podcasting, history podcasting in particular, between academics who do podcasts and the history podcast world, because it was mostly done by, amateur, mostly men, mostly white, and it was sort of saturated that way. So we wanted to sort of shift that a little bit and become a podcast that would bridge the gap between academic work and the public facing element of that. And by creating these sort of narrative podcasts that are informed by both our feminist pedagogies and identities and our academic training. And so that's sort of the founding story, myth, whatever you want to call it, of the show. And we've been doing it now since 2017, so 7 years. We've got like 200 plus episodes. And yeah, the main goal is always to sort of take the cutting edge research that's available to us, because we're academics with academic jobs. So we have access to academic libraries, which is not something that everybody has access to, which really sucks, because there's some really cool, interesting new stuff being produced that, if it's $150 hardback, a regular person's not going to buy that. And they're also not going to have access to it because they don't have access to academic libraries. So so that's sort of the goal, and that's what we've been doing all these years.
But of course, producing a podcast episode is very different than writing a book. So how did this project come about, writing this book?
Yeah, so the book actually came out of sort of the podcast because Michael McGandy, who was at the time executive editor of Cornell University Press's Three Hills imprint, approached us and asked if we'd ever thought of leveraging our identity as podcasters and sort of our popularity to write a book. And we were sort of like, no, because we do a podcast. But then, like, as soon as he floated the idea, our brain started working and we were like, well, this would be really cool. And also, there's this place that's not far from Buffalo, which is where we were all based at the time, Lilydale, New York, which there aren't really any academic histories about, and really not even any particularly well received, I would say, or deeply researched public history or popular histories. So this seemed like a really great opportunity for us to explore the crossover genre, where this is like a peer-reviewed book, but also it's aimed at sort of a general audience, much the way that our podcast is.
So I have done podcasts with another person before, so a two-person podcast, even that is unwieldy. So I'm impressed that you guys managed to have 4 people on a podcast. 4 people on a book seems like a lot. So talk me through the process, how you figured out who was going to do what, how you were going to write this, without all devolving into a mess.
Well, at times it was messy, so let's not sugarcoat that at all. It was, I think it comes out of our grounding as feminist historians, in that feminist pedagogies in history are collaborative, and really all history is collaborative, even when we as historians pretend that it's not, right? Because we're working with archivists, we're getting peer review feedback from friends and from formal outlets, and that's all part of the process. But in this project, it was collaborative on another level. Like, we went and did all of our research trips together. We went into the archives and sat there at the Lilydale Museum, rifling through materials and showing each other things and collecting things for each other and putting them in folders, saying, "Oh, this would be something good for Marissa's chapter, or for what Sarah's working on right now." And so in that way, it was collaborative feminist work from the go. And as we were sort of workshopping the proposal and thinking, well, I could write a chapter about this because it sort of has roots in what I do for my own independent work. And Marissa could do this because she has these personal and also academic connections to that. And Sarah is from here and has this like deep, she's the first of us to have ever gone to Lilydale. So there's all of these personal connections and then sort of academic connections that we established and built over the course of outlining and sort of brainstorming and dreaming what the project could be. And then the writing process, we had like, oh, everybody was going to write 2 chapters. And then, Marissa and Elizabeth got really busy at the time when our deadlines were coming up. So then I took on a little more and Sarah took on a little more. And that's how it just worked out. But then that also meant that, Marissa and Elizabeth wrote really incredible chapters and got sort of pulled deeply in there. And then Elizabeth now is like growing out of this project and developing a new project that is based on the research from her chapter. So it's been like this beautiful, evolving tree of life that just sprung out of our collaborative friendship and academic partnership.
So you've mentioned a couple times your identity as feminist historians, and I think that's one of the really important things to understand about spiritualism and Lilydale is that it comes out of course, women, really girls, and the experience of girls. So I want to talk some about that and how it starts there, and then of course, like many things, it doesn't necessarily the girls don't get to stay in charge forever. So can you talk a little bit about that background, how that is the beginning of things, and where it kind of goes from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are listening and unfamiliar, spiritualism is founded, or at least spiritualist historians and spiritualists themselves identified the founding sort of myth or story or moment of spiritualism as the moment when Kate and Maggie Fox, who were an 11 and 13-year-old sisters, started hearing rappings in their home in Hydesville in Western New York, which is just outside of Rochester, New York. And they started hearing these rappings, and then they started like responding to the rappings, and eventually, with help of their older sister Leah, developed a code to sort of decipher what the raps meant. And then through all this process, they discover that he was a peddler who was murdered in their house and is buried in the basement. And then that sort of becomes a flashpoint in which then they are sort of tested first by Amy and Isaac Post, who are sort of wealthy Rochesterians. And I always say it's not Rochesterians, but we'll just pretend it's Rochesterians. And I'm sorry, people from Rochester, don't come for me. They're also Quakers, so they're deeply involved in the abolitionist movement and feminism, and so they're early feminism, and so they test these girls because they had lost a child when the child was young, and they wanted a chance to connect, and so they test the Fox girls, and they decide that the proof that they offer is real. And then the Post sort of introduced then the girls to all of these other wealthy, connected people in the area. And then they put them up in and put them on stage at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester, which is like a really big deal. And Rochester in the 1840s was a booming town because of the Erie Canal. So it was this like nexus of tons of religious reformers, right? Joseph Smith finds the golden tablets at the Hillcomore, which is just not far from Hydesville itself and from Rochester either. It's not far from Oneida, the Oneida community, which was founded by John Humphrey Noyes, who's like all about the Fourerian model philosophy for, sexual and spiritual development and family. There's all these religious revivals happening in this area known later but as the burned over district, because there's so many waves of religious revivalism just like burning through this area. And so they go on stage at Corinthian Hall and they demonstrate their ability to communicate with spirit in 1849, just a year after they first start experiencing these raps and these communications with spirit. And so that becomes the sort of founding moment of spiritualism. And not long after, right, like there's just thousands of mediums who identify themselves, and most of them are women, right? So this becomes this is made possible in part by a burgeoning, growing feminist movement and a number of other sort of elements of everyday life that sort of open people to the possibility that this was real, right? That first things like technological advances were sort of outpacing people's understanding of science. Things like the telegraph, right? That's so suddenly now you can communicate with someone instantaneously who lives thousands of miles away. That was like, well, if we can communicate with someone instantaneously 5,000 miles away, why can't we communicate with spirit, right? Like those two things don't seem so different to regular people. It's also a period when in the nexus of this burned over district, people are like playing with new religions all the time. Like they hear a new preacher and like, oh, this speaks to me. So I'm going to do it. And then the next week they go to another, oh, this actually speaks to me more. So, right, like lots of movement in religious experiences. And then in terms of feminism, 1848 in Seneca Falls, which is not far from Rochester, is the first International Women's Rights Convention, right? So this is a moment when women are seizing some authority, some power, and mediumship is a way for women to do that, because people listen to mediums because they want to hear from, famous, people like Erasmus or Thomas Paine might come through, or John Locke might speak through one of these mediums, one of these teenage girls, one of these women, or the opportunity to connect with your own dead loved one. So that sort of power and political footing is something that women don't always have access to, but spiritualism, which is woman-centered especially in its early formative decades, it is. But as you say, right, this is not the long-term necessarily trajectory of the movement. In the 1870s and 80s, it formalizes as a church. And then while it's still in those early years a feminist church, right, and like founding members of the church will write these like histories of spiritualism. They're like, oh, and women should be leaders because of all these reasons that they're better than men. And we should put them at the fore of governments and everything because of their purity and their goodness and their openness to spirit, right? But then over time, men take more positions of power. They reshape and reformulate what spiritualism means and what spiritualist organizations or places like Lilydale should look like, how they should operate. So that sort of really shifts, especially by the 1920s and 30s. Places like Lilydale become male dominated. So where once the president of the board was always a woman, now it's a man, and women are like auxiliary members of the board, or they are the secretary. And so it becomes very much like many of the other Christian or religious movements of the United States. But that said, then I think we see another shift back, right, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, which is not something we get too much in the book, but it's certainly the sort of wave that we see. It mirrors much of American history, I would say.
Yeah, and those connections like Seneca Falls, that's not just a geographic connection, but there's real there's actual connections there.
Oh
People
yeah.
like
Susan B. Anthony is a
yeah, Susan B.
regular.
Anthony.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, so like suffragists are coming to Lilydale and people from the temperance movement. There's lots of
Yes.
interconnections there between suffrage and temperance and spiritualism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, like, Susan B. Anthony is not a believer as far as we know in spiritualism, but she understands the power and popularity and the movement of spiritualism as a place that can and will and does support suffrage. So she utilizes that platform really effectively. She comes to Lilydale like almost every year for 10 years or something ridiculous to speak. And spiritualism, right? As you say, like there are real tangible connections. And I think in part that's because spiritualism is a religion of learning, right? Like part of the experience of going to some place like Lilydale or Casadega, Florida today, even is, yeah, you're going to go for the medium. You're going to go to, be read, to have this spiritual, emotional experience, but you're also going to go to lectures, much as you would at the Chautauqua Institute, not far from Lilydale. You're going to go to workshops to learn a new skill or to learn, maybe it might be a physical mediumship skill, or it might be something interesting, like about a book. It's so there's this element of learning that is embedded in spiritualism, and it's not just learning about spiritualism and mediumship. It's learning about the world, which is, I think, one of the reasons too that people like Susan B. Anthony see this as a really valuable place and platform for advancing the cause of suffrage.
So one of the other things I found interesting about Lilydale, and really all of spiritualism, but you see it in Lilydale, is this like self-policing nature. Like they know that there are fraudsters and con men in spiritualism, people taking advantage of this. People, and anyone who's watched a lot of murder mysteries like I have knows that there are people who have abused things like spiritualism and seances to, in the murder mysteries I watch, it's always to like murder someone. But, in real life, it's just to con people out of their money, right? And so they want to make sure in Lilydale that they're not, that those people are not giving spiritualism a bad name. And so over time, they limit the amount of, I believe it's called like physical mediumship that's allowed to be done, and then reduce it altogether. Can you talk about the ways that happens, the reasons that they are doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, first and foremost, the founding again story of spiritualism is physical mediumship, right? Like the girls, the Fox sisters, they hear raps and knocks, or produce raps and knocks, really, and that is a physical demonstration because you're hearing, like the people in the hall are hearing the raps and knocks as well. It's not just something like the non-physical mediumship is just sort of a medium might receive a message and then tell you that message from spirit. Whereas a physical manifestation is going to be something like producing sounds, table tipping, spirit trumpets sort of playing themselves, or the manifestation of ghosts and ectoplasm, like figures, these kinds of physical, like, oh, you can see and touch and almost experience yourself as a spectator, the medium's power. Okay. So that is very much a part of spiritualism. And spiritualism, in addition to being a religion of learning, is also, in many ways, it considers itself a scientific religion, in that spiritualists from very early on, from the Fox sisters, right? They invite people to test them, to scientifically test them so that they can prove, A, that what they're doing is real, and B, that there is like scientific proof of the afterlife, which is something that people really crave, and which is one of the reasons that this is such a popular religion in the 19th, early 20th, and even mid 20th century, right? Especially in moments when we have huge deaths like Civil War, World War I, World War II. There is always in those particular moments an upsurge in popularity of spiritualism in the US and Britain in particular. So with that in mind, right? In places like Lilydale, which is founded in 1879, and from the get-go, there are going to be people coming in and setting up shop to do physical demonstrations, whether those be automatic slate writing or table tipping demonstrations or spoon bending or seances where something will happen, whether it be a spirit trumpet's going to play or ghosts are going to touch you on the shoulder in a dark room and whisper in your ear, right? So that is part of the Lilydale experience, particularly between 1879 and say the 1940s. If you go there, you're probably going there for that experience. That said, the Lilydale Assembly, like the board, the people who oversee everything about the town, including who gets to buy and sell land or houses there because they own the land as a private corporation, and then they have to approve anyone who wants to buy or sell houses or live there, basically. But also they approve who are the official mediums of Lilydale. And those are the people who are going to do the messages at the stump, which is where you go to this place in the Leyland Woods, which is it's just like a beautiful I don't know, uncut wood with this like stump in the middle of a clearing. And that stump has, significance to the spiritualists there. And people will get up and do readings to a crowd. Like it's like 2 or 3 times a day, something like that. So those mediums have to be officially approved by the board. But people who are just mediums from anywhere who do these physical manifestations, they can rent houses and cottages from the people who own them and set those up. And that's what they do. So the Lilydale board is really like careful about saying no one who is an official Lilydale medium has ever been investigated for fraud or accused of fraud, I should say. Lilydale has been investigated a couple of times. The first big one being sort of in I think it's 05 or 1910 with Hereward Carrington, who comes from, he's a well-known in the early 1900s as a paranormal psychology investigator. This is what he does. He goes around and he does like real official scientific investigations. But when he went to Lilydale, he was just sort of pretending to be a regular visitor and only writing down his observations and then reporting those in the American Parapsychological Journal type thing. And so he's like, yeah, obviously I feel like this person was just making it up, or like I saw the little ghost child running in and out was obviously like a regular child, but I didn't conduct a full scientific investigation, so I'd have to come back to really disprove any of these things. But yeah, again, Lilydale is really careful in saying, well, those people are just like doing what they want to do. They're not our official medium. So there's that like semblance of respectability for sure. And then in the 1940s, as there's like more and more scandals, I will say, that end up shutting down other camps like Lilydale, they just like the onset, like vampires, that one gets shut down because they have a big scandal in Massachusetts. They decide in Lilydale, well, we're going to just ban physical mediumship entirely because this has become too much of a problem. Because the people who are doing physical mediumship can and sometimes are doing it with ill intentions or to make money, and it is fraud. But the people who we have vetted here and do the mediumship that we've approved, they're real. They're the real deal, and we want to make sure we protect that, right? And we want to make sure that this is a respectable place where people can commune with their dead, basically. Yeah, so it's a shift too, but that doesn't mean that physical mediumship goes away even after Lilydale bans it. And it's certainly, Marissa was just telling me because she lives down in Florida that she visited Casadega and that they're experimenting with physical mediumship again. So you can go places and still experience the physical mediumship element.
I want to ask about the archives themselves. So in Lilydale, there is the Lilydale Museum, and Lilydale has its own historian who you write about in the book. Can you talk some about that? What is available in general, what you were able to access, and then some about the process of, as a historian, what you can give back to the archives?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ron Nagy is the current historian and archivist of Lilydale. He doesn't have formal training, neither did his predecessor. So archives is probably, it's not an institutional archive like if you visit the National Archives where they have like intense boxes and rules about which, you fill out a slip of paper and you turn that in, you say, here, I want this piece, and then they give it to you, but then you have to get a slip that you'd return with it, right? So it's very organized and is intended to protect those materials long term, right? That is not necessarily the case. They don't have the funds, they don't have the means, they don't have the training to provide that at Lilydale. So it's the museum, and the museum has all kinds of physical ephemera, which is really cool, right? Like they have the hotel registry books, and Ron has noted all the famous people who signed their names in the registry books, like Susan B. Anthony and some famous actors from the 1920s. Is it Mae West? I think Mae West was there at some point and paid for something to be built. And so the museum is like the main part of the archives. It's this room or two rooms, I guess. So like a little back room that has some spirit photography in it and some other mementos. And then the archive is the other back room, which is not very big. It's just like a bunch of filing cabinets and some shelves with some plastic boxes that just have stacks of things in them. So, yeah, it is a system that only Ron can navigate, really, because he holds it in his mind. So hopefully he trains his successor at some point or communicates with that successor from the afterlife. Yeah. And when we got there, Lilydale has been burned before by people who've come in and used their collections and studied this town, like Christine Ricker, who was a journalist who wrote a sort of unflattering portrait of Lilydale as, a bunch of kooks and weirdos and maybe a little bit crazy, whatever. And so they're kind of wary of outsiders who want to study the place. But Ron eventually warmed up to us and so helped us to find the things that we were looking for. Like, we'd have conversations with them. Oh, I want to know about this, and I want to know about this. And Ron has a pretty incredible sense of what is there and what isn't there. And even like a regular person might come and be like, my grandmother visited here in 19 something. Do you know? And he's like, how do I know your grand? But here's her registered name in the book, right? Like, so he's a character and wonderful. And ended up, it took us a couple of visits and promises that we were not trying to write an expose of Lilydale for him to warm up to us and then help us give us access to some of the things that are in like locked cabinets. And then that was really, really helpful. And what we ended up doing was, we had short trips that we would go down to Lilydale, which is about 50 minutes from Buffalo, where we were all living. And we would photograph everything and take it home so that we could do our work, in the off season of camp season. So that was all those records we ended up sending to Ron so that he would have the sort of digitized records saved, which is, I think, one way that we, as historians, working with a, in some ways, vulnerable collection can be helpful, right? And, we're just using our phones with a scanning app, but that is going to preserve something that has the potential of being lost, forever. We also got access to, thanks to the board president, the meeting minutes of the board, which, wasn't easy because it's a private corporation, so they don't have to let anyone in. But they were really gracious and gave us access to those. And some of them were in really rough shape. And again, we made some recommendations for preservation, like what archival boxes to get and how to store them and where to store them and that kind of stuff. So hopefully I know that they're making those adjustments after our visit, and hopefully that will ensure the longevity of the collection, because it's really, it's like fascinating stuff. And like we stopped at however many chapters, 6 chapters, but could have written, you could write multiple books just on the happenings at Lilydale and the sort of intersections of various different histories in this place, which is a place out of time in many ways, but is still a thriving and interesting community.
So speaking of a place at a time, I think the final question I want to ask is just, you were very deliberate about writing a history and not a sort of sociology of the present. Of course, you're all historians, so that makes sense in some ways. But I just want to ask about how you sort of balance that as you're writing. This place still exists. There are still people living there and working as mediums there, and how you think about that. It's very sensitive to write a history of religion always, anytime you do that. So just sort of how you reflect on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we had many conversations about this from our very first research trip there when we retired after a long day collecting materials in the archives to the Victorian B&B that we were renting, the top floor of for the purpose of our research trip. We're sitting in the little living room and chatting about like, what is our goal here? How do we deal with the issue that you're talking about? Like, how do we write this history in a way that is respectful, even as we are ourselves not believers or in some cases like me, like extremely unbelieving and distrustful of any organized religion, spiritualism notwithstanding. So I think the main way we approached it was, well, we don't actually care what people believe, or it doesn't matter to us if they believe or not believe, or sorry, it doesn't matter to us if this is real, right? Like, we're not here to prove whether spiritualism is real and it has proof of the afterlife. What we care about actually is that people believe it, and that belief then moves them to do X, Y, and Z. And then how those X, Y, and Z's then intersect with these other issues, whether it be things like appropriation of Native American spiritual healing and culture, whether it be advancing the cause of suffrage, right? In hosting things like Women's Day, in hosting talks like Susan B. Anthony, in advocating for and pushing for getting women the right to vote, and ultimately successfully. So that there are all of these ways that their belief in spiritualism made those other things possible, for better or worse, right? And so our goal was not to shy away from the sort of cringier moments of the history, and some of those histories are very recent, right? And ongoing in many ways, but also to do so as respectfully as we could, right? And empirical evidence, all these kind of things are the ways that we do that, but with the sort of sensitivity and empathy that it is a living community. And so that means that we have to be aware of that and remind ourselves again and again that it doesn't matter if it's real or not. It matters that people believe it is, and that history is important.
All right. Well, please tell listeners how they can get a copy of the book.
Oh, absolutely. So our book is available in a number of bookstores across New York State. So if you're in New York, you can easily get it. But if you're not, then you can order it online or on Amazon or on the Cornell University Press website and enter the code 09BCARD. You will get 30% off, which then sort of makes it slightly cheaper than Amazon. But then you're ordering from, not Jeff Bezos. So highly recommend. And it's a beautiful book. So 10 out of 10, you want a hard copy. It's obviously also on Kindle, and we're working on an audiobook now, but this is a book you want on your shelf.
Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we talk about?
Let's just make sure also, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about spiritualism or any of the sort of rabbit holes that we tease at in the book, we've done a bunch of episodes about that are connected to chapters and threads that we tugged on in the book, and you can find those all at digpodcast.org.
Avril, thank you so much for speaking with me. This was really fun.
Yeah, thank you too. It was really nice to meet you, Kelly. Thanks for having us.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode in a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!